Hello everyone, today we talk about The Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker, as I've been asked very, politely and indirectly to comment eventually on this author more than else, and by one of my followers that has given me the great opportunity of talking about a lot of interesting things, also provided actually with some content himself. So I care about his interest in this figure, and he was rather critical of Pinker, and I understand why, and I agree on the general take of the figure in itself. I wouldn't say that I dislike very much the figure. I honestly, I surely heard of him before I gave a quick look to his exploit. Academically, he's mostly a linguist, and he dealt with a lot of broader political and social issues, including the Better Angels of Our Nature, that fundamentally deals with topics that touch us very closely on the channel, that is violence, and let's say the decrease of it fundamentally in by scales of magnitude in the history of mankind up to this point. And I honestly I've stopped on The Better Angels of Our Nature because I found out this is essentially the most important work dealing, in fact, with the aforementioned topics. Here I see other publications like Enlightenment Now. These are some of the most recent. I think I don't remember where The Better Angels. It's a 2011 video, The Better Angels. So time has passed, and I see here other in the same year, in 1211, The Decline of Violence. Then in actually 2021, Rationality, What It Is, Why It Seems Scarce, Why It Matters. Other ideas of this kind. Also, I've given a quick look to the general reception of the work, and I have acknowledged that fundamentally Pinker has been recently criticized actually by one of those forces that I think are surely the dark ones, right? Because by arguing, fundamentally the premise of the author was, especially in this Better Angels, but in general, was that fundamentally the treatment of say the decline of violence, we will see better how it happened. We'll try to criticize the discrimination against for example, homosexuals and or other minorities and racism, etc., but also the treatment of women, children, animals, etc., has improved. And so given the recent wokeism wave that occurred, it seems that this position triggered the radical left, because it said, no, it's not true, there's still all this terrible discrimination everywhere. So I can't deny that Pinker in this he defended himself in actually standing his ground, right? He didn't he didn't give much to radical left in this sense. It seems to me, even though I must be honest, and this is something I should never do. I read a book last year, was one of these greater titles like Anson, I don't even remember the title, but it was about the causes of the Western superiority, let's say, in the world, at least, something that he treated in very different terms, but at least very, no, Diamond, excuse me, not Hanson. Hanson has nothing to do with that. Actually, he would be to be criticized. There are many authors we could criticize, but yes. And I haven't read The Better Angels of Our Nature. It's a pretty long book. I would like to read it, frankly, because I've read the review, and it's kind of those books that put a lot of stuff in, right, to make the point. And this book has been apparently acclaimed as one of the greatest masterpieces ever relevant, one by other great authors and so on. Others have criticized it mostly for the same reasons you would expect when you look at this kind of, generally speaking, liberal and overly, enthusiastic, progressives. That is just a potpourri, a melange of different, different things that actually do not, that maybe even well put together, but do not actually prove something other than some kind of journalistic approach. I may disagree because again I haven't read this, so I wanted to answer the question that was posed also because I must be honest, I'm interested now in this author because it's not on the top of my interests at all, frankly, but it's one of those topics that it's the author whose topics are worth being discussed in the way, if anything, they are framed. Because reading through, I've read my follower sent me a The Guardian article that I've read quickly a couple of times, then eventually it asked for paying because I couldn't watch it anymore. And more or less I got the point. And the actual article criticized heavily the work, and also mostly from in terms of the violence, that violence is not really declined in human nature, of course. And it seems to me that article was a bit too, it's as if Pinker had actually stressed this. Pinker, in some phrases that have been quoted there, specifically says that the decline in violence that we have observed in the last, according to him, in his last centuries, we'll comment on this now, is, if of course it can be reversed, and that specifically humanity is not intrinsically violent or non-violent. That is to say, I presume as a linguist he has also a great deal of kind of idealistic approach, even in the good sense of the term, meaning that you actually have to make a choice, right? And it is the case in terms of individual responsibility every time it gets down to violence. So I thought it was relevant to give it a further look. And the article, however, mixed the criticism also with another author, sounds similar to Singer, actually, and others. So the thing digresses a little bit, and when I looked at the information on this author, I learned actually very different things from what the article says. So I thought to comment on some points that here are provided actually by Wikipedia, and mostly in a review to the Better Angels of Our Nature, which seems quite comprehensive of the work's content. And it's not that I trust Wikipedia per se, but it's the type of which is very schematic, as we will see now, so it's easy to follow. It's the type of topics addressed that are worth commenting, at least for what it said here. And my follower told me that the guy is also a bit too much in the threat posed by artificial intelligence in a kind of a Terminator scenario style, which, yeah, I agree with also with my audience, is bullshit in practice. I think that artificial intelligence is a quite delicate topic, but at the same time, no, that's not the scenario we should fear. There are many other problems already at the start of using artificial intelligence that are completely different. And yeah, war will always be fought by human minds, right? And that's the only way you can do for many reasons. Again, I can make a video also on why I think so on artificial intelligence in the first place. And that would be interesting also because this follower is a mathematician, etc. We talked about von Clausewitz. He understands very well the Clausewitzian theory. So I would get it now to this kind of sort of review. And so I read directly from Wikipedia. Says, the author argues that violence in the world has declined both in the long run and in the short run, and suggests explanations as to why this has occurred. Alright, so is this premise, first of all, correct? Well, indeed, in terms of relative, let's say, amount of debt on, like in relative terms, right, on the overall population, yes, let's say that violence has declined historically, right? And it sounds hard to say such thing in such times. Yes, we are indeed living in one of the most pacific times in human history. And naturally, this is a different point than saying, okay, what is human nature fundamentally about? But it's important to stress, and we'll see now properly, what is the attitude of mankind towards war, right? And the general, I can say it from the start, that the general criticism that I feel to move mostly to Pinker's theory is not much, it's typical, right, of many authors that, say, of many intelligent people objectively. I also met elsewhere in my path, etc., at university, some great experts of this and that, however, maybe they nail the point of many issues, but they can't frame it in a broader picture. Maybe they contextualize the scene from a perspective that may actually be harmful in a sense. That is to say, violence is a mean to an end. So what we are analyzing here is not much properly the use of violence per se. That's why I would point out as a Clausewitzian, but the reasons and the motives. And there is no doubt, again, that our worlds have grown, our communities have grown more pacific historically than before. This is debatable at some levels. Let's say in historical times, this is true. We should see what certain properly ideas and lifestyles actually brought on the fore in terms of possibility of forming the ideologies necessary to exercise violence also for a positive purpose, or how much violence and its horrors were actually functional to the development of civilization. But also, as far as the hunter-gatherer lifestyle is concerned, I don't think, frankly, that those worlds were more pacific than before. In fact, this is something that Pinker says himself. So he may be a misunderstood author in some way. Let's try to get better with how he explains the thing. So, because again, the point of the author may be that at some point we get to, and this is what my follower actually even asked me, because he said, I don't know whether he openly claims that war can be eliminated, which I don't think Pinker does for the aforementioned quote, because he says the trend can be reversed. In fact, this was one of the main criticisms he had to answer to. Like, do you think he really said no? And that's an important thing, because in my opinion, that he gets it. But the problem is he may not address, which I don't know, given that I having not read the book, that violence could actually be necessary to the same civilization that we have, right? And this is the general point that I make throughout all my work, which I doubt Pinker does. So I would think that's the main, and it's a big deal of a divide, frankly, in these ideas. I also don't know what he thinks about von Clausewitz. So again, this is just a video I take to discuss the points that we'll see there have a lot of food for thought just for how they are listed here, and also for some studies. For example, Pinker is a fan of Hobbes. I've studied Hobbes at university at some point consistently, and I have some idea about him. It may not be particularly refined, but also finds me in disagreement with a certain aspect of Pinker. Because again, this is like debating on whether the glass is half full or half empty, and so it depends on what essentially from which side you want to push, more or less the balance. The sort of balance. So it's really relevant in my opinion. And yes, the impression is that Pinker makes it a bit too pink, in fact, that is, everything is going to be better, or, at least if we keep up with rationality, etc. I think that in the last years, if anything, Pinker, exactly because he has been aggressed by the radical left, etc., must have come to terms with the fact this is not quite true. In fact, some of these critics, as also that the Guardian article pointed out, says that in order to be consistent with the claim that we're getting more peaceful, we should also wait more time, because really from the Second World War, the end of the Cold War, actually the end of the Cold War triggered a lot of other forces out there, as we'll see right now. And given that Pinker uses a lot of statistics, which is not really a good, mean, at least methodologically speaking, there should be more to substantiate, of course. But to say, many statisticians themselves said, we should wait more to have some conclusive evidence that, at least from a statistical point of view, we can make a point in that regard that violence is really declining. Again, this is not a provocation, given that there is a horrifying war going on right now on our same Europe. But the question is, again, looking at the thing without the emotionalism that, of course, is also an anti-Clausewitz in principle. Wars must be, we must study wars in order to actually being able to fight them, right? So it's extremely important to be also able to use violence. And that the most important, in general, probably educational, understanding that we need in terms, even just if you want to educate somebody, you must use always a level of coercion, a level of violence, right? Because otherwise and we always use at every time. Then, of course, there is a way when there is a moment where violence, of course, does cause problems. And I would say this, you will allow me to this kind of digressions, because they are important points I also made in the past years, and recently I haven't gotten much back on the theory of the art of war, etc. But there are moments in which violence is, most of the times violence is objectively not a good idea, right? It's one of the, and we are seeing it right now, indeed. For violence is just an option that we have, and it's kind of the quickest one in most scenarios, but say most of the times not the best one. And in general, this is not a statistical observation, or at least it would be if we have to make an historical case, but in the sense that we have to understand the logic that connects the use of violence with properly the purpose that we have for it and the objective that we want to achieve. So even in front of this is the true meaning of discipline and cold blood and reason that both von Clausewitz and also the peoples who used violence the most in history had actually acknowledged by just exercising violence. That even when somebody is doing something horrifying, there should always be a rational response to that, even in the same use of violence, but also properly in the ponderation which degree of violence should be used, which type of violence should be used or not used, right? I'm not even referring to the current situation, which is, of course, the fact that, if we were to go at war with Russia, it would be just the Third World War. Nobody, we can't win in much more effective ways, let's say, considering the outcomes and so on. So there is always a risk, right? But politically and strategically, there is properly a point, and that's what Schwerpunkt in itself basically shows in its concreteness, that are even in, and especially given that war is a political act, that always have to observe what are the possible consequences of this, right? Even in terms where, I don't know, there are scenarios where there are riots or things like that. Not always brutal repression is, the best option, right? And I'm a person who, in determinate situation wouldn't have the minimal problem of killing another human being from any moral or scientific standpoint. I'm just saying again that this should be done in ways that are intelligent, that are able to see what are the pros and cons, what are the consequences of that are largely unpredictable, but still that, should push you to understand further the picture so that you can intervene more effectively in it. So I say this because there is a lot of authoritarianism that incidentally is proper of those cultures that I deem to be inferior and in fact are the ones to make a poorer use of their strategic means, as we're witnessing nowadays with Russia, and that directly stem from the de-education to violence in a moral and scientific fashion that has nothing to do with acting tough or being, the hyper macho guy. That's just, a declaration of inferiority compared to what properly von Clausewitz and the same, I don't know, we talk a lot about the Indo-Europeans because I want to properly understand ethno-nationalists that they have, they have nothing to do with the tradition that they're allegedly trying to defend, because Indo-Europeans thought a completely different thing, given that the absolute universal ecumenic ruler model was a person completely devoid of any emotionalistic attitude, which instead that kind of animal-like instinctive attitude was in fact properly the opposite of it, was crushed in that mythology, and it was always defeated. Always, I always say, think about Athena and Ares. Think about probably the Olympic gods and tectonic ones in all the Indo-European religions. So this is really important to me and for my audience to understand, because I realize that I'm collecting an amount of completely, it's just what the next generations are. That is basically hopeless. And so if we can save some of them, somebody from them, it's fine, right? But we also have to be realistic about what's the matter we're using here. So, quoting Wikipedia again, the book uses data simply documenting declining violence across time and geography, which already by itself, it depends on how it's done, but it may not be everything. This paints a picture of massive declines in the violence of all forms, from war to improved treatment of children. He highlights the role of nation-state monopolies of force, of commerce, making other people become more valuable alive than dead, which they definitely are, and this is something I agree on, and it does depend on that kind of state force. On this, there are states and states, because it's not just force again, and that's a point that I'm not sure whether Pinker makes, because even quoting Hobbes, it's a pretty primitive idea, by the way. It's even pre-Enlightenment, frankly. So that's what he loads, and it may be a kind of contradiction. Of increased literacy and communication, promoting empathy. I think that empathy derives from scientific understanding, right? You cannot have moral capacity without empathy. Like, literacy and communication are important, but considering the fact that we are living in a highly literate world and looking at the average person understanding of reality, I don't think that that's enough to just accept certain ideas, and I think that the reasons are also different. Definitely, Pinker does stress that these changes are the product of a contingential cultural and material situation, right? So that's what I also agree, right? Of course, this is the example you can make given the recent events. Thinking we didn't know maybe at the beginning what COVID could be about, or think about the disaster, the nuclear disaster could happen. If you start thinking in moments of danger, or of great privations, etc., the first moves you have to do, you're immediately thinking to the core, to the essentials, to things like, I have to fight against other people for the control of resources, otherwise we would die, and it's decisions that have to take immediately. And so the use of violence immediately comes back. It's written in our genes. There's nothing we can do. So as long as Pinker says that this is, in fact, that what we observe historically is just of course, the consequence of a contingential and earned situation, by the way, not something random, something that was properly built with a mean to an end, civilizationally, rationally, morally, and scientifically. I'm fine with that, because it's also my view. Generally speaking, I'm developing a bit more of a double thread view on how civilization evolved. It's not necessarily state building per se that we should celebrate as a huge achievement. If paradoxically, making even more Pinker pointed is to say, every individual could have a literally, following his better angels, right, a better nature. But we know, unfortunately, that there is kind of a brutal fallen nature of ours, for which we do need brutal force, authority, discipline, and imposition by a certain degree to keep things together, right? This is not an opinion. This is how every single state in the world works, right? This is not being part of, common law or civil law, whatever. It's what it gets down to. So ancient religions actually believed something different, and in the same Christianity part, the idea that there was a depending on the situation, in part we were doomed, and they all believed we were doomed. This is interesting, that all religions think that at the end things are going worse, right? This was true in the Indo-European religions, was true in the Judeo-Christian religion, and that tells us something, because it referred to a state of nature, of a golden age, that we have also in the same contractualistic philosophy that Pinker surely discusses. Actually, authors like him probably take in a very modernistic and secularistic way, and they have lost properly the knowledge and the understanding of the possibility that there is, at least in potential, an absolute clarity that could be achieved. And this is what the point that Pinker makes. That is to say, not necessarily because he says this, he's a person who, I'm not entirely sure whether he's a pacifist, for example. He sounds pretty liberal, but I'm not sure he's a pacifist. And the purpose of every civilization is peace, right? So this is one side of the story. And so when he talks about the better angels, given that he uses also this terminology, it is quite indeed ancestral and does refer also to those older religions, the meaning of angels, that is literally, a dualistic figure, actually, right, with an idea properly of good and evil, that must be properly tamed. Remember the video we made on the Indo-European Holy War? That's exactly the purpose, that we all have this spirit within us that we can have the possibility, that is very chthonic per se and terrifying, but if we are able to tame through reason, we have the possibility of literally transfiguring and becoming divine. It was the Indo-European belief. This was achieved, by the way, in war, through the exercise of violence, that had to be the most rationalized of all. Again, this is always why Athena crushes Ares, because Ares is the average today idiot that doesn't fundamentally understand anything but raw violence in an instinctual way. Athena is pure reason and kicks ass all the time, all the freaking time, invariably, right? So it's an idealistic point. We all strive for living in a peaceful world, right? And this, of course, doesn't mean that war can be eliminated, because there couldn't be, paradoxically, a peace if there wasn't properly the capacity of waging war. And this is the entire vision of basically any civilization that ever existed. And as we'll see now, this attitude of, let's say, pretending that violence is decreasing as some, because the first thing I thought is that Pinker could be a culturalist, and I don't think he is, right? I may be wrong. Again, I haven't read the work, but the culturalist would say that just, war is a cultural option. That is to say, if you are into war because you're freaking animal obsessed with violence, you're just a barbarian. You should be taken out of civilized world. This is a completely racist, idiotic belief that is dramatically spread even properly in military academies in the West, etc. People that have never even opened the film Krieg and so on, and that's bullshit. But if we are talking just about the possibility, of course, of always doing better, and that this better basically does involve a broader pacification, we should discuss what are the means of this. And I think the reason, if Pinker likes it so much, I think it is really the thing, without hypothesizing it in ways that he may be doing actually with the Enlightenment, this liberal progressistic mythology of the Enlightenment that, again, as we will see, is just an illusion. Not because the Enlightenment is good or bad, but because it's just, it's something that in a sense follows a universal path of human existential development. It's not what has been idolized by progressives in the last generations, right? It's something pretty much obvious, and that, by the way, especially if you pick 18th century philosophy, literally everything of 18th century philosophy had already been said in the 17th, and at the end of the day, this broader concept are something that already all the ancient religions said. So that's the cultural and intellectual disease that a certain part of the Western Academy, probably the majority, has bought into in the since the 60s, the 70s, for highly ideological reasons, and that basically we are also paying the price of, because they have taken away violence from the equation. In other words, those cultures were telling us that without violence, you couldn't quite achieve any peace. And this is basically, in fact, what all the pillars of Western civilization tell. I mean, the Romans, civis pacem parabellum, or the Germanic Friede, that means literally the peace in arms, right? There can't be any order if there is not a force that puts that order together. So actually, this is quite important, and it's mostly probably what the main problem with liberalism today. It gets that the suggestion that the freer you are, let's say the more equal you are, the better it is. It's actually bullshit, right? Every single human being is better or worse than another, qualitatively, right? The things like human rights, etc., are just juridical conventions. They're not descriptive. They're prescriptive of how individuals should be allowed to live by certain basic standards that we recognize as functional to the contingential political and social situation we are now. But there is no such thing like equality. It's a delusion, right? And that's what Pinker, I think, has been, been finding out the hard way when the radical left began to attack him. So this, I mean, my impression of Pinker is probably the one of the, a bit like Diamond, etc., this exalted intellectuals who thought to be the top of the, of the greatest civilization ever, that could fall in love with itself in a narcissistic way, and just not accepting that reality is a bit more complex, a bit more ugly and dark, and actually, but actually positively workable in this regard. So that Pinker's work seemed to be more, in fact, descriptive from these reviews to me than prescriptive. And it seems actually in the last titles that we've seen now from the last years that it's getting more prescriptive, because it's starting to say, look, I realize that it's not just, being born in the West that makes the magic. You have to keep up with that, because otherwise people just regress into lower forms. And so we should do that. And in order to do that, you have to fight. In order to do that, you have to impose, you have to fight for your ideas in a way. So you do need violence in some forms, right? And violence, again, yes, is paradoxically exactly how what the leftists think violence is. Everything is violence. This has nothing to do with the way it should be regulated. I can be violent in my speech and not giving a fuck what whatever other person believes. And so this is based, again, on political and social balances, for which actually it's become dramatically easy to become more effective and more successful by being violent, because people are becoming ever less violent and ever more agreeable, and that's frankly disgusting, because I do believe actually that the sap of civilization lays more towards the in fact, the virile, disciplinarian, authoritarian side, let's say, within the limits, again, of the functionality in our community, than the other model. So that's where I also get a bit, worried by something that Pinker says, because while it is true that we have been treating certain individuals better, this doesn't necessarily mean that we haven't lost something in the meanwhile that may have been actually important to preserve it, together with this good achievement after all. But that requires a greater capacity that we may not be witnessing, because the decline of violence actually could be even an extremely risky thing, because we could simply let ourselves be run over. And I think that the reaction to Russian invasion in many people in the West is actually showed this, both among the left and the right, not because they have any particular ideology, actually because they don't have any form of culture or education whatsoever. And culture and education shows you consistently what are the achievements of civilization through an intelligent use of violence, which, again, the criterion to be defined is completely beyond basically any kind of commentator that you can watch on TV or on YouTube. And I think that is frankly sometimes extremely naive, right? We are treating reality just in a dialectically descriptive way, and not really doing anything about changing it in practice. So the point here, done nation-state monopolies of force, is unfortunately necessary, right? If you're doing something pretty stupid and you're damaging me and you don't stop it, I will break your fucking teeth to the point you will understand and you will cut it out, right? So that's actually a pretty positive idea, in my opinion, that you should be able to use violence in those terms. The same goes for commerce. Like, if we have something in common, as we all have, and we can improve from cooperation, that's great, that's fantastic. And so the increased literacy and communication definitely did help a lot, as a matter of fact, right? If, I don't know, from the other side of the ocean, of the Atlantic, we had found more civilized peoples, definitely, that may have even given rise to greater conflicts, because we would have been just bigger civilizations, but surely it would have been easier to deal with each other. And so also the way, frankly, Europeans, treated Native Americans by a certain degree was not really as, the new delusion of, the anti-Americanism that also is eating itself alive from within the same alleged Americans, is, saying that America was hopelessly racist and all this bullshit, is actually realizing that those who were there by civilized standards were just a bunch of savages who killed, raped, and enslaved each other all the fucking day long. And that's the pretty solid historical assessment that a PhD, specialized military history can give you about those wars. This is not to say we should be happy of that. Again, that's the stupid take on it. It's a terrifying thing. It was terrible, but kind of those people were terrible as well. So, think about that. So as we are looking at, as well as a rise in I'm quoting from Wikipedia, a rational problem-solving orientation as possible causes of this decline of violence. Well, yes, I mean, if you're a reasonable person, you're a more reasonable person, you can find better solutions to conflict. That's pretty much agreeable as an opinion. So Pinker notes that paradoxically our impression of violence has not tracked this decline, perhaps because of increased communication. And yes, I believe so. I mean, I don't know, there are so many important things in the world that happen. Let's leave aside from a moment the big Ukrainian topic, but let's say it happens to me. You open the media and they tell you that there's been a Pullman accident with 50 dead from the other side of the world. I mean, who the fuck cares about that? I mean, honestly, there are much more important things. There are much more than 50 people being killed for much more serious reasons all the time. On a regular basis, nobody gives a damn. So increased communication has surely paraded, violence sometimes in a kind of, in fact, emotionalistic and entertaining fashion. And this is for most wars that have been going on. I mean, that if I, just look at, I was saying that about Syria, for example, some time ago, how it was pictured. Like, it's not that if you followed the news, you would understand what is actually happening on the ground. While we have all the open sources about that, studying how I think produces strategically, they're just names. Nobody would look at a map. They would just tell you that somebody blew himself up, killing 30 people in a market, or, when gas was used or something like that. It's just a lot of shouting. But then nobody really understanding your political strategical situation, right? So that is actually, in fact, a downside of such increase in communication. And in fact, here it says that Pinker accepts a further decline as, let's say, not inevitable, actually. So he says it's always about an option, right? So he's optimistic, and he says, maybe we'll always improve, but it's unlikely, to tell the truth, and sadly so, because the political and social instability of our communities is too high to presume that we will not screw up badly quite sooner or later. I mean, just think about those fucking idiots that shot at, the nuclear plant of Zaporizhzhia. I mean, that's the degree of radical cultural inferiority that we're talking about, and those are the people against whom you should use all the possible violence, exactly for schooling them in the ABC of human civilization. But we need to be doing that, right? So it says, so fortunately for Pinker at this point, it's contingent on forces harnessing our better motivations, such as empathy and increasing reason. This thing of empathy, yeah, I must give you, it's important. It's important when you relate to somebody. If you don't know how to behave, it may be. I tell you, I'm terribly low in agreeableness, which makes me actually pretty offensive in many instances. I'm really a person who talks things to the face. It can get quite easily, aggressive in determinate circumstances. But yes, of course, I understand. I mean, when other than responding to your instinct, you should be able to understand what the other person is telling you and see whether the immediate discomfort that you're getting from a certain reality could actually lead to an improvement of the situation, and by also not giving that person what is not to be given, right? You don't have to always compromise, and that's why we need to use violence. But again, as we were saying before, generally speaking, there is always a better way, right? And who can tell where's the end of that, right? Unfortunately, we are limited in time, as in lots of other things, but this is the reality we have to face. So sometimes most of the times we can't do better with empathy and reason. Sometimes we just can't. In any case, empathy shouldn't be taken as everything is, should always just be good. Avoid conflict. Solutions will find themselves. We are creating the fourth estate right now. The hundreds of millions, if not billions, of newly civilized masses that we're putting in the system have this only idea. It's basically a conflict avoidal, that is to say, burying problems under a carpet and letting life destroy you and others together with you. And this is in many ways what leads actually to the greatest amount of conflict and even violence, as we can see, because it's typical of actually underdeveloped countries and communities where violence is much higher for that reason. And that surprisingly corresponds to that kind of lower education, lower democratic, civic culture, democratic education and everything. And there is obviously, yes, a reason, right? We are children of the Enlightenment, whether we like it or not. Yeah, exactly. Also because the Enlightenment, as Kant said, is probably, the capacity to put yourself in the light, right? So to take yourself out of the condition of darkness, of inferiority, of ignorance, in which you have put yourself. You decide constantly to put yourself in. So it's always a matter of individual responsibility that takes action, not passivity. And that's why, instead passivity, I explained this in those videos when I was answering what is the West according to you. I've come to realize this, that clarity, reason, logic, and morality, science are fundamentally what the West hyper-intensified the understanding and application of, as opposed to other worlds that are much more kind of dominated by hubris and ignorance and fatalism and emotionalism. And that's fundamentally, what the forces of civilizations, in fact, have always operated dichotomically like, right? The light has always been able to rule over sometimes probably enormous masses of darkness, because the darkness was inferior morally, it was weaker, right? It was more violent, but in a more stupid way, and therefore it could be defeated dramatically easily. And this is also a Clausewitzian concept, by the way. So here it says other things. I could even quote it from Wikipedia. It's copyrighted stuff, but the book's title was taken from the. Okay, well, this is not many part. It basically says that there's been a decline many domains by scale of military conflict, homicide, genocide, torture, criminal justice, and treatment of children, homosexuals, animals, and racial and ethnic minorities, which is true, by the way. And guess why? Guess what's the element of the community that still whines about the fact this is not true, because it's completely uneducated and idiotic and irrational and ignorant and emotionalistic and fatalistic? Of course, the fourth estate. Mostly the radical left, but actually many conservatives too that are the same level of underdevelopment and that make this kind of senseless points without any compass whatsoever. And so Pinker stresses that the decline, quote, the decline, to be sure, has not been smooth, it has not brought violence down to zero, and it's not guaranteed to continue. So as long as he says this, I have no problem with that, because it's real. I mean, I have maybe a problem to the idea that, that violence could be brought to zero in the first place. That's quite problematic. It may be the same problem that Pinker has with artificial intelligence. I mean, you may think that if you had an extremely simplistic view, probably from a scientific point of view, of the complexity of human communities, and it's also the human mind, which is, I guess it's not flattering for somebody who's a linguist or a a scientist, whatever. I don't know. But what is disturbing is that limit. It's thinking that it's possible to be achieved in absolute terms. It should be just tending towards that, but not giving people the impression that it can actually be achieved, because it may distract you from the way to it to come closer to that, which is, you see, it's physically impossible. It doesn't mean that it couldn't be done. It couldn't be, that our situation could be improved, but could be attained in absolute terms. Of course, it's impossible. Now, this is also interesting. Pinker argues that the radical declines in violent behavior that he documents do not result from major changes in human biology or condition, which is in fact the case, because genetically we are wired to that possibility of becoming a killer in less than 3 seconds, were we in the condition of being threatened for that reason. He specifically rejects the view that humans are necessarily violent. Now, I don't understand what this means. It says, and thus have to undergo radical change in order to become more peaceable. Well, this may be true if you consider how flexible our mind is. I mean, you don't have to be necessarily violent, meaning, as I was saying before, that you don't have to you don't have to enact physical violence normally. And this is, I think, what all human communities have shown historically. And again, what I would like to stress also as a historian and as a medievalist, so somebody who studies times where pre-enlightenment, and so that could make an example, and we've seen in all our videos, is that that violence that was described wasn't really the violence that we intend in an hubris sense. I mean, yes, there was, again, a way of, things were less developed than we were, but they were not necessarily less intelligent. And also in those times, there was the better way of doing things and a worse way of doing things. And in that moment of civilization, that kind of violence was kind of necessary in a way. I mean, and it followed a logic that is quite cold and rational if you look at it, right? The Middle Ages have been presented to us. People liked war because they thought it was fun and cool. Nobody ever thought that. They would do it because the level effect of of coercive capacity, of subtle development, etc., would just make the whole freaking situation constantly unstable, and so you just had to act on that pace. And it's exactly through that active and deliberate and logical and rational use of violence that things like what were achieved up to today, including through the Enlightenment, were actually attained. I mean, they were the same people, right? There wasn't a magic idea that changed the world. It was just an accomplishment based on a development that had not been known before, right? You can't consider it in a non-progressive, positivistic sense as just putting a patch over the various problems and just going on with that, which is normally what humans do, because the whole freaking system is too complex in many ways to have a control on it. But I do agree, in fact, that these peoples had much clearer than us the idea that if everybody was really rational fully, they could have a much greater scale of peace and order and prosperity than we think today is possible, even though we're kind of much closer to that, considering our means. And so we should also reason, again, being very humble towards old religions and ideas, because they were in many ways much more sensible and even when violent, and properly so, than what we do today. Because today we may have properly forgotten the meaning of violence and why it's so important to obtain peace. So then he makes the nature versus nurture argument, which gets down to the way that, quote, the way to explain the decline of violence is to identify the changes in our cultural and material milieu that have given our peaceable motives the upper hand. So again, I agree with this. I don't think there is anything wrong with it. It's how it happened, right? This means that genetically we didn't change, that behaviorally we, exposed to certain situations, we would be that violent as before. So I think Pinker is correct in this. I didn't see much of a... So Pinker identifies 5 historical... This is getting interesting. 5 historical forces that have favored our peaceable motives and have driven the multiple declines in violence. So they are, well, he calls it in different ways, the Leviathan, a reference to Hobbes, the rise of the modern nation state and judiciary, quote, with a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, which can diffuse the individual temptation of exploitative attack, inhibit the impulse for revenge, and circumvent self-serving biases. Yes, this is a very important aspect indeed, and I agree, even though Pinker stresses that Hobbes is underrated and all these things. Hobbes made a terrific job of his time. The historical context is fascinating, as an exile, the English Civil War in France, the whole thing of regalism, etc. And he was terribly pro-monarchy at the point that in all this enormous, in fact, work that he writes, you can never find, even once, even the concept that when through the social contract, a certain power is delivered to a central power, this cannot be taken back. Well, that's the thing that always perplexed me about Hobbes, that he would never make that point. Of course, he had his political motive, but all the complexity of the corporalist metaphor, etc., he doesn't say something so simple that even if you give power to somebody, that power, could be taken back. If anything, it doesn't mean that it would be easier, etc., but the most obvious realization, that is to say that without the decisive moral force of the people, no government can rule. Well, that's one of the most important aspects in my opinion, because again, states exist if people agree that this thing is functional, right? And this is true even for totalitarianism. So in this sense, Pinker is okay. I'm okay with him. I would mostly say, again, distinguish what, as always, in a reasonable way, makes the good state and the bad state. Because I've seen even among conservatism this kind of libertarian obsession that frankly leads nowhere, because it just takes to study a little bit of history to realize that the greatest driving forces historically were also the ones who could literally control better and in more effective way properly the use of force through a statal capacity, right? So there is here, we should digress on so many things that we can't really, but I think that as a general trend, this is true throughout all history, right? It means different things and it brings different outcomes, but on average, yes, that's the direction we have taken as humans. It seems to be pretty universal. It's not an option, it's not an opinion. And then commerce, the rise of technological progress allowing the exchange of goods and services over longer distances and larger groups of trading partners, so that other people become more valuable alive than dead, are less likely to become targets of demonization and dehumanization. Yes, but at the same time, this was achieved through violence as well, right? So demonization in general, dehumanization as an extreme of it is is unavoidable by a certain degree, right? Discrimination is important exactly to spot those who are opposing the improvement, and this happens from within the same communities. So commerce per se, like this idea, we will just commerce so we will not make war, is is just a factor. I understand this is not understood as decisive, but it could be a bit more complicated, because in order to get something from you, to give something, you also should kind of think that you already are some kind of good person, right? That's the reason why I don't want to trade with people who do pretty bad things, and there is something more about that I presume commerce sometimes doesn't really show. So that if you pick slavery, for example, that that may be, it's still part of the game, right? Surely in a world where human life costed dramatically less, and especially the life of some people costed dramatically less on the market, because of course they were less developed and were easier to, there was less resistance, there was less capacity, that was enacted, but I still agree that, let's say, the wealthier we can get, and say the better we can improve on the base of that wealth. So this is no surprise, right? Everybody used slavery all over the world. Every single freaking people. Guess who were the ones who abandoned slavery first? The Westerners. That is, the ones who rose to the top. Not because they used slavery and the others didn't, but because also they expanded more. They brought down people that at some point they realized these are kind of savages in a sense, and also, terribly exploited them, but with such a capacity that made it evident that after all there was no need to treat them like that in the end, and would open politically to greater rights, to liberalization, all these things, and so from which the world has dramatically benefited in process. So that was a normal mean that was used by everybody. Those who managed to intensify the understanding of the system, even exploiting it, but were the first one to surpass it. Then feminization, increasing respect for the interests and values of women. This is the kind of sounds like the feministic, as if he had to insert this point about in the list to sound, acceptable enough for the liberal agenda. Actually, I don't know how he deals with the concept, right? Feminization increases respect for the interests and values of women. Well, this is an interesting and deeper point than it seems, but at the same time, it may not be all that positive. This is a very controversial topic that I haven't addressed yet, and that may sound, in fact, too controversial. I'm perfectly fine of respecting increasingly the interests and values of women. The point is that women as men do not exist but in function of each other. So by feminization, what we have, this sounds, it's a sort of literally of a even more effemination, however, of the system than else. That is to say, masculine and feminine exist because they are together in the reinforcements of their own core, make the couple stronger and more powerful, civilizationally speaking. So what feminization seems to have corresponded to is to actually the spread of the archetypal lack of essentially to emasculation, if we could say. But this is not much about women per se, but it's about also the emasculation of men. And I would say it's easier for human nature to lean towards feminization, especially when things go smoother. And guess what has actually happened, right? So at that point, when things go smoother, of course, there is no need to overexploit anybody. Women were exploited in the past, of course, because basically everybody was exploited. Like, it's not that men, just because they had the command, were actually living much of a better life than women. Actually, were the ones who took the hardest, and still today it is. Like, men are the ones who extensively suffered the most of the greatest efforts and the worst employments, the kind of, of greater pressure that is put. And it is meant to be so. this has nothing to do in that sense with what is instead happening right now, that is the feminization of same men, right? The idea that civilization is something that needs leaders, and so some kind of more aggressive, authoritarian, and violent element of the community to achieve, which is biologically the one connected to masculinity by hormonal, biological reality and existence, is exactly what we're lacking. That is to say, we relaxed, we became slobs. We thought that everything is just, some kind, leading a community is just about, knowing science and saying, yeah, I'm a feminist, and actually not knowing science and knowing that feminism is just a sexist ideology, just like masculinism is, and that, in fact, break that couple that masculinity and femininity must embody constantly together to be any meaningful or any functional. And so this feminization, in my opinion, is mostly an euphemism when we look at the historical reality. So again, I'm perfectly fine for respecting the interests and values of women, where these are the actual interests and values of women, of biological females, and what they're structured evolutionary to be, right? As also the male ones should be. But what has actually happened is the archetypical decadence of masculinity as the driving force, in fact, of the same violence which is needed to create civilization. Which means what? That fundamentally we have lost our, if you want, exploring, entrepreneurial, aggressive, even risk-taking nature of masculinity in a sort of ever more submissive, fatalistic, emotionalistic, subjectivistic approach that fundamentally makes us collapse politically and strategically and morally, right? To the point that, again, nobody really understands what to do in this world anymore, right? There are just lunacy left and right, just sitting there and doing nothing. So the important would be here to reinject moral force, and by reinjecting moral force, men would be ever more men and women would be ever more women. So the appalling disaster and promiscuity and ambiguity and confusion that is taking place nowadays is actually not much a problem of the due because somebody came up with a radical leftistic ideology. These things always existed throughout history. It's just that they were curbed. Nowadays, people are too weak to just to oppose them, right? So it's not really a problem because those are non-ideas. The real problem are the rest of the people who are supposed, to just have a brain and that don't use it because they don't know how to, because they don't have moral force. They're not capable of using violence anymore. And the same goes in many ways for probably what women should want and do against this, that also because they are the ones who are losing the most from that, right? They were already losing with feminism. Nowadays it's as if they wanted to be cancelled in a asexual reality or something even kind of more perverse than that. So the decline of masculinity is definitely one of the negative elements that we are, witnessing from development. Which again, development can happen without civilization. This is the point I'm making, and this is the point I've always made. Right? We should be increasing morally and scientifically at the same time. What actually happened historically speaking is that morally we're going down, and scientifically we're going up. So in other words, we know a lot of things, but we have not the palest idea of how to use those. Actually, we don't even know those many things anymore, right? It's the same relation that exists between the mass, say the substance, and the form, the hierarchy, right? We need to couple both of them. At this point, we are just favoring the mass, either in form of nationalism, that leads straight to collectivism and actually communism at the end of the day. Because nationalism is a disgustingly anti-traditional collectivistic ideology, which has nothing to do with anything, you know, in fact, that is supposed to be preserved. It's just an exaltation for the weak, exactly for the inferior element of society, feeling that they are worth while they are completely worthless. And if they knew anything about the past of the people they presume they're kind of emulating, they would just, you know, take out themselves immediately. But of course, they're too weak and cowardly and narcissistic for that. We're not talking about communism. That is complete denial of any kind of humanity in any possible form, and so that's the end of any kind of reality. But we're witnessing that. So I would say that Pinker's idea in this sense would help. It's a double-edged sword. I mean, not even, right? Pinker could simply say, we should use the better angels of our nature to become actually stronger, more aggressive, because the more we are, the least people will fuck with us. Right, and so we would have actually a much better, orderly, sane, intelligent, developed world, and not still entire masses of hundreds of millions of people who believe in bullshit and can, you know, let their governments just do whatever the fuck they want because they've been deprived of any kind of traditional knowledge after, I don't know, 70 years of communism, and pretending to be a normal people, you know, 30 years after that, and after centuries of, you know, brutally ferocious authoritarian step-like regime, right? And the same goes for the West. We achieved a lot, and we relaxed, and so we are imploding, right? So there is nothing happy about that either. In any case, the list goes on and says, cosmopolitanism, the rise of forces such as literacy, mobility, and mass media, which can prompt people to take the perspective of people like themselves and to expand their circle of sympathy to embrace them. If you couple them with the Leviathan, yes, like, definitely literacy, mobility, and mass media also have to be regulated. This is the other aspect. Like, you don't just give people states and cosmopolitanism and things work well. Again, without moral force, all these things can be used for the worst ways. Think about how the media are used today. They're just an echo chamber for ideologization, both left and right. They're disgusting, as a matter of fact. Do anyone actually care about scientific assessment? It's just shouting the news first and giving you the interpretation that they want you to believe in, to make you feel, again, that you're special because somebody is saying the thing that they tell you to think. And you feel part of a group, and that tells you, you know, the degree of, you know, complete lack of any tradition and culture that you've gotten to. Because that's something you should be able to do by yourself. Instead, you need somebody else to do that. And just listening to it. So basically doing nothing. Give you a complete fictional reality of presumption, right? Rather than connecting you with the action and with faith and the reason and self-control. None of that. Then he says, the escalator of reason, an intensifying application of knowledge and rationality to human affairs, which can force people to recognize the futility of cycles of violence, to ramp down the privileging of their own interests over others, and to reframe violence as a problem to be solved rather than a contest to be won. I disagree with the definition. Violence is not a problem. Violence is a mean to an end. So I don't like this idea. I like the part when it says, you know, when you understand that objectively there are some solutions to problems that do bring to conflict, but not necessarily to violence in the way we intend. Like, you know, there are lots of conflicts in the world, and a very tiny part of them are solved with violence already. And this, again, is mostly what Pinker is saying, right, that happened historically. But here, probably the terminology is in the mechanism is completely misunderstood, right? It's true that knowledge and rationality show you how to solve problems better. But again, it's not that it shouldn't, but it doesn't take out the military option of the table. It's always there. And actually, one of the best solutions sometimes could be violence. Right, so I don't know what are the cycles of violence, because this is, again, the progressistic delusion that people made war for fun before. This is not true, right? Every war that was fought was the expression of the greatest rationale, and actually of forced contingencies that those communities were capable of of expressing. Um, you don't study a war and say it was just the pure hubris of somebody that brought to that. It's not. Many wars were bad ideas, as we're witnessing nowadays, but they were seen as always a mean to an end, right? There was nobody that really thought of what they could be wrong about it, and they are wrong about it because they may not be enough developed to understand certain things in a way. The perspective, especially, that's really dangerous. But it has not to do with the use of violence per se, right? The cycle of violence. What is a cycle of violence? In a world where you're competing for resources to a level like you can see in the Middle Ages, for example, it's obvious that everybody tended to exploit the situation because otherwise it would be taken out. Today, the world is so complex, so far more complex that it's objectively the motivations for resolving problems with violence are being reduced, because if anything the options are many more than just violence. And violence, again, is a huge gamble, and it should be sensible, something properly, decided on that base. And it may be actually that Pinker's idea about this is where he says, especially, we need more reason. Guess what? The world you thought where violence was declining may actually be bringing more violence in relative terms soon, exactly because people don't understand things anymore. In the past, we understood it more. So that level of state of development, commerce, kind of being more compassionate towards the feminine side, intertwinement, etc., is not enough really to especially intensify the application of knowledge and rationality to human affairs. That does happen, but especially in a time like today when the world has literally boomed to the point everybody, so many countries in the world are simply emerging as, realities that you can't quite control if they say no, right? This is a new situation where violence is more likely to break out. So if these people are intelligent enough, of course they will make the better choice, but it seems to me that we're giving too much for granted that human capacity, especially without a progressed tradition. Like the West had really a long time of an incredibly delicate balance in moral and science, the way they were properly conceived and thought and applied. Some countries really don't. Some countries come from realities that are terrifying, of incredible moral and material misery, in a way that you can see, again, the atrocities are being committed today because they can't really do better than that, because that's the poor degree also of their own self-regulation, which may be, again, at Pinker's point, but again, it doesn't mean that this thing is completed now, that we arrive to a point where things are always going to be better. It's not necessarily so. This depends on many things, and it may be true, but maybe the broader trend, I believe, is true. I believe that humans want to improve their conditions, but it's not necessarily they're going to achieve it all the time or that easily, especially when so many competitors are brought in without control, and they're terribly dangerous, and they can, cause damage to the whole system, to especially make the people who are resting on the delusion that, again, we will not recur to violence anymore, to rest and to soften up to the point that they will not be able to react when somebody uses violence. Doesn't matter how stupid. In other words, the lesser use of violence doesn't actually mean statistically that people are more or less likely to use violence again. Also, by the way, one of the major criticism that has been brought to the attention of Pinker is that great part of the reason why we live in one of the most peaceful times in our history, if not the most peaceful time, actually the same Pinker says, is that, of course, of nuclear deterrence. That in and of itself still does enormously increase actually the violence potential when unleashed. About this, I would say that it is true in a way, meaning that the same means that we have acquired in order to dispose of weapons of such huge destructive capability are per se the same realization that, after all, war shouldn't be convenient to anybody, because these means were not really used to destroy other countries in the world. Surely in part because these means were shared, so there was the fear again of the same deterrence, but also because objectively nobody really wants war. Like, the idea even of having a nuclear weapon to put down an enemy is, as von Clausewitz himself says, it's the aggressor really that wants to have peace more immediately, usually, because that's the one that is making the greater fort after all. So the question is evidently a bit more complex because, thanks to atomic weapons, we put an end to, for example, some wars like, I don't know, the storming of Japan that would have costed an enormous toll of lives, civilians especially, that was completely unnecessary. It's obvious that the destruction of the entire human civilization, like it could be like in the Cold War or even right now, it's a very different thing. And people who have these means fundamentally realize this, even if we did go pretty close historically to such destruction. And in a way that helps, of course, the same civilization to reflect on it. Right, it may be that it's not worth it. We don't know it yet, right? Because we still didn't destroy each other. But it seems at least the most, let's say, the absolute standard. You don't want to even try, of course, to verify this, to measure this, the effects of this compared to the achievements of civilization. Naturally, this is complicated enormously by the fact that, in fact, as we were saying, knowledge and rationality may be regressing in relative terms in the world, in the moral force that is needed that carries them. So, again, in a sense, it does make Pinker's points, because if you assume that the world at some point will be so interconnected that nobody really has the need to fight each other, well, it could even happen. War will always be there, as far as we understand. At least we are extremely far from reaching that point. And this would occur in kind of a, exponential progress that would bring us all together so easily that it would be like a paradise. We are evidently not there, not even close. So, I generally speaking agree with the points, right? I just think that we may be tricked, of course, by the nuclear deterrent as such that already per se, just in the risk of the potential destruction, could account for actual destruction, and that, however, doesn't mean that we can't get to the point where that thing wouldn't be that needed, right? And this is valid for lots of other things. This is not just about violence. It's not just about war. I mean, we have ways of destroying ourselves that are already happening that, we don't give too much importance to. And in so many ways, we don't have still the means, properly the knowledge, more than the rationale, to control the complexity of the world. That's another problem that at this point, considering the means available, is pretty pressing, and that we are probably doing a great job at, even if we don't, we don't score this dramatic success yet, but it's still the civilizational progress going on. In any case, of course, none of this means that violence per se is, it should be seen by individuals just like a contest to be won for the sake of itself. Because even when this is conceived as such, it always responds to a political and social situation. And so violence is just, again, a mean to an end. It could be another thing that we don't care about. And factually, when we concentrate too much on war per se as the problem, we lose track exactly of those political and social contexts that brought to it. I'm personally very surprised when people are surprised that certain people, certain country can do certain things. Because if you've just studied their history, you realize that there is, again, nothing to be minimally surprised of. How do you think that civilization is acquired? Again, just by, some material wealth? It doesn't work like that, right? It takes a hierarchy, it takes an order, it takes a discipline, and a pretty qualitative one that can keep the balance up. It can keep enough people being capable of cooperating, having the properly, in fact, the knowledge and the rationale to know how advantageous that is. If people are ignorant, hopelessly so, they're not even taught how to reason. Of course, they will try to do reasonable things and will even achieve it in some measure, but it will be much less than an orderly community, right? So, yes, this may have objectively happened in the West. In fact, Pinker's being apparently criticized also because it concentrated mostly his analysis in the West. But in my opinion, it reinforces his point, because the West is exactly the one that actually achieved that. So liberals don't like to say this. Also, Diamond doesn't like to say that, as we've seen it in the book we have reviewed about steel illnesses. I don't remember the thing. Yes, and the truth is that it's actually the case, right? That a typical liberal at that point would say, but what about other humans? So are we saying that others are less developed? That's racist. Well, it's actually true. It has nothing to do with race, as a matter of fact. It's just human beings that are exposed, in fact, to worse realities, and we have to face reality. Because again, otherwise, somebody will use violence on you. You will neither understand why that's the case. After all, in the last decades, the West took a pretty series of, striking offensives from people that, again, we thought, yes, we had reasons to not to be particularly sympathetic towards the West, but they were not good reasons. They were not even based on actual knowledge. They were just, fruit of the misery that, might have been also consequence of some Western exploitation sometime, but has nothing to do, in fact, with the complete and utter shortcoming, if not complete failure that those people did. And that's also the accountability. That is, why do you hate other people if they effectively achieved something that you were not able to achieve in the first place, and that you kind of continued to remain in a way, and that, yes, others took advantage of, but just because you would have not gotten any better out of that. So it's quite, and I'm talking again about probably the use of violence, like how, what did actually, the Taliban's achieve by taking down the Twin Towers. Right, big firework, big deal, scare, terror, dead people, symbol of the West taken down, all the things. But then, is the West any less present significantly as a world power because of that action, or is it because just others are growing that fortunately have are also not coming from the most underdeveloped places where such terrorists actually come? to pose a threat, and or maybe because it's the West that already was undergoing some problems on their own. And what was the point of that? It was actually pretty stupid to do. Also because it would create other problems. Right? In fact, other people died from the side of, those who, carried that devastation out. It was much greater than that devastation. So I frankly, that's you understand the stupidity of it all. And in general, I think that the reversal of regimes that are, dictatorial, genocidal, whatever, it's always okay. Like, I wouldn't mind. It should happen everywhere. It's just it should be done well, right? So you can't even criticize, the Americans for Iraq if you can't distinguish the fact that, taking down Saddam was actually a pretty intelligent thing to do, and that just where they screwed up was afterwards, the way the thing was handled. And fuck international policy, right? People actually even believe in that. I think there is a legal code people state. Don't you study history? Don't you know that it's never been the case? And that, yes, we do have a general approximate code of behavior, but you cannot complain if your country starts doing pretty stupid things. It's told to stop, it doesn't. And you telling them, look, we're going to bomb you. No, I will keep doing it. And then they bomb you. You start complaining because they bombed you. That's just how children behave. And frankly, there is no pride in belonging to cultures that behave like this, because that's how they behave. I say, who the fuck cares at that point if you get beaten? That's the point of the story, right? So any form of weakness, in a way, it could be, first of all, prevented from the side that suffers it. Exactly, if he understands what violence is, because understanding what violence is understanding the connection between politics and the military instrument. So becoming a civilized country, generally speaking, is a pretty good idea. And if you can't, it's not because you're poor, it's because you're stupid. And very often the two things go in parallel, unfortunately, right? But still, this is no excuse for being stupid, ever, right? That means that you can't fundamentally detach yourself from a material reality. And still, again, stupid ideas remain stupid ideas, because it's not that if you don't have the means to understand something, at that point you are excused from the consequences that you cause when you do that something, because you did that. Nobody told you to. Nobody imposed it to you, right? It's like saying, I'm hungry, therefore I will steal to eat. Nobody fucking cares about you. You're a fucking thief, and as such you should be treated. There are other means to interact in this world rather than doing other stupid things, right? So violence in that regard is, again, not a good idea. I don't condone the fact, I'm not saying even for wars in general, before I was making an example of Iraq. Not that I condone, I don't give it, I condone it on the base if it was a disgusting dictatorship that deserved to be taken down. I don't like how it was done, because that was actually lack of knowledge and rationality. Then there is a bigger level, that is where you can also debate whether that war had to be fought or not in the first place. It of course remains, that is political and strategical in the first place. Right, and that must be weighed, and it's not easy to weigh it, because again it has a global scale, and again it's becoming increasingly difficult to make decisions on that base. So even when these decisions, as we've seen, are taken, it seems to me that there's been actually a decline historically in the capacity of taking such decisions. That may have to do properly with the complexity of the system, that we still haven't been able to sort out effectively. Like again, a medieval lord went raiding the other lord's lands to weaken it but generally speaking, you could see there some behaviors to say, well, these people just seemingly would do it even just because they took things like honor or other kind of mobster ideals to their heart, but they still seemed much more wired to reality in relative terms than the reasons why we make wars now. And so this general idea of decline, again, may be connected with what the same Pinker thinks, actually what this great modernity brought on the fore. Because modernity is fine. People should know how to handle it better. And I'm sure Pinker makes a similar point. And most people that are, especially the most stupid, instead thinks that the problem is modernity itself. Right? Those are the iconoclasts, are the Marxists, are the fundamental terrorists, are basically all the people who realize that they are too inferior to make sense of complexity, or even to try to, and so they don't achieve anything. They prefer to tear everything down and to destroy any capacity of doing better in the first place. So those are the forces of obscurantism that we're actually fighting. And many of these forces may have actually originated not as a consequence of the Enlightenment, but as the same reasons that brought to the Enlightenment. Because I think that the Enlightenment that Pinker so much likes is actually a consequence of that relaxation that brought people to simply say, I don't care about it anymore, I just responsibilize myself. It's a great part of that feminization of culture that drew away from probably the necessity of being competent and able to know how to lead for the sake even of political compaction or military action that is necessary in a civilization sometimes, and exactly to knowing how to do it well and not making disasters. So in this regard, it may be that, especially in fact in the last decades, I don't think that is true. I don't think that we are really witnessing less violence, right? In the last years especially, violence has increased compared to, 20 years ago, or even less, right? Even from the first half of the 10s, violence in the world has increased, right? It has increased, by the way, for many reasons that are mostly the ones that we see more comprehensively, rather than specific individual responsibilities, because the thing is too large by scale, and so it's always about individual responsibility, but also in the interaction in the complex whole. But again, if we were without nuclear weapons, probably we would have known much more war, and in ways that would have probably shaped up our need to find a solution to put this thing down. So it's remarkable in a way that we didn't use our means of mass destruction to the extent we could already. And that means that we are perhaps reasonable. We're not necessarily more feminine, we're just simply more scientific in some way. And so it's always a double threat. Then there is this other part here. Oh my god, it's excruciatingly long. Anyhow, the first section of the book, chapters 2 through 7, seeks to demonstrate and analyze historical trends related to declines of violence on different scales. Chapter 8 discusses defining inner demons, psychological systems that can lead to violence. Chapter 9 examines 4 better angels, or motives that can incline people away from violence. The last chapter examines the 5 historical forces listed above to have led to declines in violence. So we will see them now in detail, but these inner demons, the psychological systems that can lead to violence, they do exist. I like the fact they're called demons and angels, etc., because also are kind of the same thing, as you know, mythologically. And again, I can't see even in this like a specific semantic mistake in the term used. I think that even the lexicon was carefully chosen to avoid misunderstandings. In any case, let's take a look. 6 strengths of declining violence. 1. The pacification process. Pinker describes this as the transition from the anarchy of hunting, gathering, and horticultural societies to the first agricultural civilizations, with cities and governments beginning around 5,000 years ago, which brought a reduction in the chronic raiding and feuding that characterized life in a state of nature and a more or less fivefold decrease in rates of violent death. Now, I generally speaking agree on the fact that the dynamic existed. I don't agree that before the first agricultural civilization, etc., the hunter-gatherers reality was anarchic. I don't believe so, because humans have always been communitarianly behaving and, politically and socially structured, right? At least this goes well before, some thousand of years before Christ. And yes, I do think that wars were somewhat less, frequent. Let's say that the statal control did lead to some kind of pacification broad humanity. This was the good direction to take, again, because it was deriving from a need. It's not that this civilization emerged from nothing. They emerged from the same hunter-gatherers, which evidently had better reasons to live like that. Even compromising with other things, but complexively, accepting it. And when you think about these civilizations making wars and being ever more destructive, etc., this is true. But again, it doesn't take it takes into account the concentration of that violence, and not the actual, say, consequences that you don't see after the war. There was also waged for having some kind of gain, and that would very often also surpass the boundaries of war itself. Meaning, war was not fought, and then you had literally to make another identical war to conquer the next place, where it was like establishing a dominion when other people would recognize you in a way of saying, okay, well, if that guy, if I do something wrong, that guy will come here and it will be bad. So let's try to cooperate at least. This naturally has a balance for which also certain civilizations rise and fall. And it does turn out that the best driven civilizations were the more rational ones, were the ones that actually knew how to make war better, and that achieved this greater, stability exactly because of that. Then two, the civilizing process. Pinker argues that between the late Middle Ages and the 20th century, European countries saw a 10-fold to 50-fold decline in their rates of homicide. He attributes the idea of the civilizing process to the sociologist Norbert Elias, who attributed this surprising decline to the consolidation of patchwork of feudal territories into large kingdoms with centralized authority and an infrastructure and commerce. Well, this is actually, it's real, right? We also talked about it on Schwerpunkt for a very long time, here and there. It was a real civilizing process. And yes, generally speaking, mortality was reduced in that fashion. You can see that wars were still dramatically frequent because, again, the powers involved were many. But indeed, within the system, even doesn't matter how much war they made, generally speaking, they had less people dying going to war than remaining unregulated locally, right? And historically speaking, like, only on this topic I should make an enormous digression, which I can't do. I should make a video about this, because sometimes we don't even know the numbers clearly, especially, before we were all talking about hunter-gatherer civilization. There are enormous debates of ethnoanthropology, of, I mean, it's really a lot of stuff, right? You can't simply quit it like the way I do. But I'm telling you what I've come to assess as a broader realization of how eventually the system developed. I mean, nobody can deny that this trend happened, but also that this trend brought to a better life for the majority of people. Right, so there is always somebody who's sacrificed on the altar of this, but it doesn't make it necessarily wars in absolute terms. Like, this is the point I was making also before with what it would have been better for, I don't know, Native Americans to remain for other millennia before reaching the same level of development of Europeans, through which they would have just kept, again, killing, raping, and enslaving each other all the freaking time, or actually suffering that devastating blow that was mostly also an epidemiological one, but also some ferocious, of course, European massacres, but still, ending it there and having today, the Americas being, civilized places, with its divides, but still, much better than then. Well, people don't, I don't know. I think that the answer is pretty clear. So it's also a pretty cynical one, because it says, but, there were people who were massacred, innocent civilians. Yeah, that's pretty disgusting. But it happened then, so also in times, by the way, in which those peoples were killing each other in the same identical ways. Civilians, there are properly people who were, as you know, ritually sacrificed as being part of a certain community. I mean, I don't have to tell you details. You know it all. So it's very different from when innocent civilians are killing today in a situation where, that would never normally happen. And just because somebody makes a complete and gross and asinine miscalculation on a historical, cultural base, by the way, because it's less developed at that point, right? So these are different contexts that also help how to see things in perspective. Like, you can't blame people just because they kill each other. They have to understand why they do it, and how they do it, and when, and which context, again, because otherwise it's just a form of of moral relativism itself. Now, that happens because human life does have a cost, right? And does really help us to understand what the situation is. Of course, also wars are different in importance, and unfortunately, they're not measured in people's lives, because in the real world, people's lives again have a cost. So there are maybe wars that kill less people, but that are much more important than other wars where lots more people die, but objectively do not impact the world, not because it's cynical, hypercritical, moral relativistic, but actually for quite the contrary. So the Humanitarian Revolution. Pinker attributes this term and concept to the historian Lynn Hunt. He says this revolution, quote, unfolded on the shorter scale of centuries and took off around the time of age of reason in the European Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries. Although he also points to historical antecedents to quote, parallels elsewhere in the world, he writes, quote, it saw the first organized movements to abolish slavery, dueling, judicial torture, superstitious killing, sadistic punishment, and cruelty to animals, together with the first stirrings of systematic pacifism. Now, yes, pacifism, this is where Pinker falls, in my opinion, because, there may be somebody who came up with the idea of pacifism, which, again, is, if Pinker thinks this is a gross misunderstanding as well, because pacifism, if you intend it as a form of absolute peace that should be ideally and utopistically achieved in theory and in wishful thinking, again, everybody is, for that in theory, but nobody should be so stupid to pretend that it's possible to achieve it, especially in the reality in which we live, because you may have to fight wars, and again, you should always be able to, in any case, in order to ensure peace, and trying to change human nature per se, as if, all of a sudden we began to understand these things, and before we're dumb or we didn't think about peace, it's just a grossly uninformed understanding. But here, at least I don't know what else Pinker says about pacifism, so I don't know. He just said that all these things were just a consequence of a contingential reality. So, it is true that movements to abolish slavery, dueling, judicial torture, superstitious killing, sadistic punishment, cruelty to animals, it's all true. It did happen. It did happen around the 17th and the 18th century. So if he quotes the 17th, by the way, well, okay, he likes obs, so it's evidently even nailing that, the fact that in the 17th century was objectively an improvement. If I mean, think about the even international law of after Westphalia and all these things. They're there, right? And they're the product of a context. And so these ideas did spread because it was understood that objectively in Europe and in the in its colonies, it was better like to live like that and gradually abolish, in fact, slavery, etc. This happened in previous civilized places at different times, right? Even the abolition of slavery at this point is so central because of the United States and the usual whining about the fact that there was slavery, etc. Yeah, first of all, it's gone. And it's secondly, and it's one of the best places to live in the world. So what the fuck do you want? First of all. Secondly, it doesn't, like, even slavery itself, like there was, in other places, there were things that were even worse than that. Like, there were times where people lived much worse than in slavery, in certain totalitarian regimes, because call it what you want, it was not legal slavery, but it was still, like, even much worse than that, comparably. So some certain forms of slavery, as we've seen in the Mamluks and other realities, were actually some forms of serfdom. So that, for example, not all slaves or, enslavement took the same form, right? Juridically speaking, right? Also practically speaking, even after slavery was abolished, where people were still treated as the slaves that they had been also before. That's terrifying, yes. But also, some say, this country didn't abolish slavery up to that point. Yes, but then you say that country realized that basically slavery didn't exist anymore already, de facto, right? That's what I'm also saying. So that can't be just a single idea. Well, okay, this thinker is not saying, of course, but, I'm just countering the current rhetorics in a way. And yes, you can attribute that to the European Enlightenment, that, again, has its roots in much older millenary ideas, because the quality of all human beings on a regulation basis is not it's not really something being born before. Even if that had even to do with the freeman, is still there as a concept, because still even the slave is to be contextualized in realities that, again, were where slavery was very varied in nature sometimes, but also because it was considered as a sort of international fair play. Like, in the ancient world, no people believed, for example, that enslaving somebody was fundamentally, like, it was normal, right? If I enslaved you, it was not another people who said, if you had been enslaved by me, you would have not done it. Everybody would have done it. And there was a specific reason that also was the same reason was keeping together those states that were evolving in civilization, such as the idea of a universal value in itself attributed to empires, to dominations, to states themselves. So it's all very, of course, it's relative by a certain degree, which doesn't make those realities better, but it makes them those realities. So it's obvious that Europe in the 17th, the 18th century was essentially the place where people had lived best already in the history of mankind since ever. And as such, they were also taking it to the next step, because in the 18th century were also some revolutions, as you know, that changed a little bit of things, and these were driven by the Enlightenment. And there is a debate about this, because Pinker's being criticized relatively to the fact that if you study, the 20th century and the totalitarian nationalist, socialist ideologies, these were stemming objectively from some kind of intransigent attitude of the Enlightenment. Sometimes there was statalism, mostly. Also this idea of collectivism in the first place. And this forced equality in a way, and that's absolutely true. I don't know whether it's a fair criticism of Pinker in itself, because I think he a bit clumsily defended himself at some point by saying, the Enlightenment is not should not be weaponized nor by the left and by the right. It was the Enlightenment. We should be happy with that. Well, in that sense, then you shouldn't just be in love pretty much with the Enlightenment per se. You should realize that those ideas were just the consequence of a reality where it was obvious that the system, for example, could be productive without slavery, where it could be more productive if people had more rights. I mean, the 18th century was essentially bourgeois revolutions. These were people that had less rights historically, but were making a lot of money, and it had come to the point it was disproportional, the relation between their merit and their and their representation politically. So that seemed a pretty good reason actually to make a revolution. Of course, this was done also not in perfect ways, and so the mobs, the Fourth Estate was eventually infiltrating. It was spreading a radical message, an extremistic message. This was, however, commensurate to the power of the state for how it was being built. A state in the form of which we still basically live in by model, because really the nation-state system has not been surpassed yet, right? It's gradually fading, but we're still living in it. And that system, we may like it or not what happened in the 19th and the 20th century, but still it's a functional system. Like it's not a disease that terrible disaster that happened to us. Like it's the same reason why we have also much of the life quality that we have now on such a large scale. And again, it was done badly, but still it was yet a step in the civilizational mechanism. Then again, we could do better. We did it the worst way, but it still has behind it a force of civilization that pushed through. And again, I'm not content with it. I think that lots of bad things and most of the problems that we have do stem from that. But it doesn't stem from that in potential. It stems from that in practice, which is a different thing. And this is not like saying communism doesn't work, because again, our life here is better, right? While communist life has never been better. It's always been worse in every single reality that it brought to. So it's a very different macroscopic empirical assessment that cannot quite be denied. So I guess that this is what Pinker is saying. So systematic pacifism, that I don't like. It's eventually not true that this brought to any kind of form of peace per se. It is true that states agreed of the fact that it was pretty bad to do certain things, I don't know, to civilians, to like that in general. It was obvious that the system was becoming also ever more powerful, with that war was ever more dangerous. So let's say this, for example, the 19th century was a moment of general, it was actually a pretty violent century, a pretty warlike one in many ways. It's just that Europe mostly at that point began to shift also after the Napoleonic Wars, World War I, I'm talking roughly, it started to mostly mold the internal situation in ways that could avoid too much trouble directly between individual states, right? There were lots of revolutions, but there was also an international system to put them down and to have a milder transition than what was radical ideologies that took place and shook the country. There were lots of wars, as a matter of fact, but again, compared to the 18th century, compared to what had happened before, objectively things went a bit more gradually better. The 20th century, the first half of it was a disaster, essentially because of also the accumulation of unsolved problems up to World War I, and probably already probably a drift before World War I in the practicality, let's say in the idea of how to make war in the future. Nobody can deny, for example, before World War I was at least a doctrinal problem that the various the various Western militaries had not quite envisaged. I mean, they knew war had changed. It's a myth that World War I generals went to war thinking to be fighting like in Napoleonic times. But let's say that kind of scale of war, first of all, was unknown indeed, and that's also another thing that has to be taken into account. But also, there was like an idea of what war was like in a political and social sense that World War I came to disrupt dramatically, and that triggered problems and horrors and disasters, and again triggered totalitarianisms all over, from communism to fascism, etc., that were eventually settled with World War II. And again, it's, if you think about that, and so that eventually the Cold War with the nuclear deterrence, etc., we are still in a pretty turbulent time that we, as I was saying before, yeah, things have improved. We have made, we like to stress the destructive aspect of the world story, but yes, also we have done an astonishing good amount of stuff never seen in history before. And the fact we concentrate on war so much as the destructive moment that we should be wary of is actually a pretty intelligent thing. I mean, we could trick ourselves into, being irrational in a way and uninformed and ignorant about it. Everybody has an opinion on such things in general, and most of the time it's wrong, simply because, they've never studied it. But the question is, also, we don't appreciate too much the enormous positive things that we have achieved together, by the way. So that is, again, maybe it doesn't take pacifism to see it, right? Pacifism is also one of the most dangerous and aggressive and violent ideologies you can think of, but with no point, because again, let humans do their job, because it turns out they can, right? Even though it takes time and they make mistakes and so on, but generally speaking, that what could go wrong for millennia didn't go as wrong as to prevent a massive civilizational development and improvement of life standards. So that can't be denied, really. Then Pinker says the long peace, a term he attributes to the historian John Lewis Gaddis. The long peace inquires into the history of Cold War. Pinker says this fourth major transition took place after the end of World War II. During it, he says the great powers and the developed states in general have stopped waging war with one another. Well, this is the thing that has been criticized the most of his work. Nuclear deterrent. Where is this? Right? What? It is true that World War II brought on the fore new ideas of the world and its rule and order, multilateralism, things that incidentally simply people today seem to have forgotten largely, when they even look at somebody who was breaking this order and saying, and confusing the order for some kind of evil force, and not realizing that the only reason, if they even can afford to say anything in a free country, is because of that order that they are, trying to bring down for iconoclastic and self-hatred and, fourth estate ignorance, fundamentally. So no, I disagree with the long peace, definitely. This is yet another true thing. We surely achieved a lot since World War II in terms of, again, those results we were talking about, but I don't think at all that the peace was maintained just because we got particularly better at not making war. We just got pretty much aware of the fact that if war had broken out, we would have completely destroyed each other like never before in history. And so that was definitely a newcomer as a factor that had never been seen before historically. And considering properly that we would have been wiped out each other with no gamble, like it's not like fighting a war and seeing how it goes. It's literally pressing a button and wiping out everything. So that's really a big game changer, and also a pretty dangerous one. And again, I don't think that. I think that if we had been without nuclear weapons, we would have kept making important war against each other, but we also would have tried to establish a much greater order that would have probably largely functioned similarly to other times historically. So probably more destructive wars, no doubt, but still ever greater forces that were kind of backing them and so within them a greater peace, independently again from the contingential situations that could have maybe made our things gone worse anyway, but maybe on the longer run I'm pretty sure that it would have been still a more peaceful time than before. Because it's not just about making war, it's about, again, as St. Pinker says, intertwining the system. So even in case of a massive war that would have brought, I don't know, either NATO or Russia in power, all these things would have, the outcome would have been a kind of a hegemonic reality. I mean, it's like a bit, World War I is a good example. Because objectively, if like the Bolsheviks would have not taken over Russia, the outcome of World War I would have been more easily handleable in a way, because there would have been less agitations politically within especially Western countries, and there would have been, of course, the absence of the massacres of the communists. In Russia, tens of millions wiped out just out of sheer incompetence and vicious terror combined. But let's say it would have probably been more of an hegemonic force. I mean, the fight against the communists continued with the Russian Civil War, all these things that were pretty upsetting. Europe was exhausted in many ways. And without Russia, let's say, and even after Russia, you see, even the internationalism pretenses were put down. Like Poland, as we've seen, was able to stop Soviet Russia by itself, right? And hadn't Poland been in between, probably Russia would have spread further, communism in Germany, in other countries, would have been a much greater problem. But in that sense, we don't know how it would have gone. It's unpredictable. But probably much of what would have happened eventually with World War II would have been avoided in a way or another. Would have been fought at the time. It would have been adjusted at the time. It might have been a broader war at some other point. But it would have probably been fought elsewhere, and not necessarily in Europe, which is what made World War II so devastating after all, because it hit in places that were necessary for the world in many ways, right? Ways we're seeing even now. Then again, we can't really make some assessment on that, but still my opinion is that a greater order would have still been possible even without nuclear weapons in relative terms. Surely not the same level that nuclear deterrence gave us, no doubt, but still in history probably, it would have been an improvement of the capacities to counter each other, which again doesn't make sense because we arrived to nuclear technology, so it's not it's a non-realistic scenario in the first place. But in fact, the same fact it happened tells us, as we were saying before, that this thing would have been used to freeze certain assets, whether it would have been the contrast between blocks, but also in the case of, let's say, one country that had nuclear weapons before all the others and could have used them, and it did, because the US didn't use them, right? The US could use an atomic bomb on St. Petersburg, on Moscow, on Beijing in 1945. They didn't, right? And in hindsight, retrospectively, it might have actually not been a good idea, considering what we risk afterwards. So that is also debatable, but in a sense, it probably still reflects the reason, the trust, at least, in humanity, which may be one of the factors here that are not really hinted at, right? It makes everything appearing much more oppositional in terms. In any case, now this concept of long peace seems excessive, seems more like a fake peace, as it really was. In fact, it was known as the Cold War. Now, the new peace, Pinker calls this trend more tenuous, but since the end of Cold War in 1989, organized conflicts of all kinds, civil wars, genocide, repression by autocratic regimes, and terrorist attacks have declined throughout the world. Well, this is hardly true. I mean, in general, it is true that, as we were saying before, we live in more peaceful times. Sure, the end of the Cold War brought to agitation to many other places. Actually, terrorism has increased, but there's not just terrorism in the world as a driving force indeed. Genocides kept happening, repressions by autocratic governments kept happening, civil wars, etc. Did they decline overall? It's difficult to tell. Surely another criticism to Pinker is that during the long peace, a lot of war happened, a lot of repression, a lot of genocide, a lot of terrorist attacks as well happened. So it's a bit of a weak position. But it is true that international cooperation seems to have, remained a standard up to today, at least, in a sense. And again, this proves that things can change. Then the rights revolutions. The post-war period has seen, Pinker argues, a growing revolution against aggression on smaller scales, including violence against ethnic minorities, women, children, homosexuals, and animals. The spin-offs from the concept of human rights, civil rights, women's rights, children's rights, gay rights, and animal rights were asserted in a cascade of movements from the late 1950s to the present day. Well, this is a bit of the liberal thing, and it's real anyhow. And it's arguably, again, positive. One can't really see a reason why certain things shouldn't be positive or shouldn't lead to a broader, to a better existence of the interested in such ways. Many people see these things in kind of two specific aspects. Like, for example, what is the threat posed by these things, if anything? Right? Let's pick two topics. Let's say homosexuality criticized morally, right? People say homosexuality now is not just accepted, it's just paraded, it's ideologized, it's enforced, sometimes probably even legally. It's true, it's really bad, but actually there are really worse things, meaning, it's bad because there is really nothing wrong in homosexuality as a biological reality. The problem is, in fact, turning this into an ideology. He's turning it into some kind of, in fact, identity that actually helps discrimination with it. And think about veganism as well. Think about better treatment of animals, right? Objectively, yes. I don't know. I personally feel bad for animals being killed. This doesn't prevent for thinking that they're pretty damn delicious to eat. Am I a bad person? Probably. Right, there is something about that disturbs myself as well. But the point I make in general is that we have so many problems right now that, in comparison to them, animals are sacrificable. Easily. Lots of vegans just buy into our religion, into a narcissistic cult of the self. Right, if you really care about animals' lives, literally every single other life choice that you make, that is to say, buying whatever rather than another, actually kills an animal that you don't give a fuck. So, I don't think that's much of a problem, but it is in theory true that if I, get scientifically demonstrated that I get nourishment from other things like plants, that at least maybe suffer too, but in different ways, from animals, for us to to feel bad about them, may substitute for a great part of our diet without actual losses what we would actually get from animals. Yeah, okay, I will not drive that movement, but if it happens, it's okay. I don't give a damn. There are much better things to think about, honestly. So yes, in the broader wake of generally speaking being more it's say open, right? This is not even about being tolerant, right? I think that tolerance is actually bad. We should be much less tolerant in general, or at least trying to understand what that actually means. I mean, open-mindedness means, you see a person coming from a certain background and you don't discriminate against them because as long as they don't really do anything wrong, and understand that, and you can always think that you may never fully know certain things, that you wouldn't know how, for example, uncontrolled immigration can lead to. It's unpredictable, right? And some indicators really show you that it's bad because it's mostly badly handled, right? While we could really get a lot of resources from other people immigrating in our countries, if this immigration was regulated and properly thought in a more engineered, even properly on an educational, economical base, it could, many kind of, think about the United States, right? So many instances, of course, migrations exist historically, and some of them have been profitable for both involved sometimes. Other times, this doesn't happen. So you shouldn't be reasoning in there on terms of which minority you belong, but actually what is the functionality of this reality, and especially on which premises you think that. Because the same idea, for example, the territoriality of a state is today people, no borders, whatever. That's actually also, it's an idiocy, right? Not because in theory one day we may live in a world without borders, because much of the borders we had in the past do not exist anymore already, everywhere, right? So it's obvious that the trend is being toward that direction, but it doesn't mean that you have to force hand that, because if we still fundamentally interact on the base of states, it's not because somebody never thought that there may not be boundaries. It's just an option that could happen tomorrow. No, it derives from certain very specific political and social and strategic considerations that actually do not give a damn about what a single individual thinks in practice. And there probably not even large movements could really influence to regulate in that fashion, because it will simply come to be how it is, how it was also in the past, operating. In any case, here the things go on and says these spin-offs from the concept of human rights, civil rights, women's rights, children's rights. Okay, we already read this. Yeah, this happened too, and this happened because of the obvious well-being that we could afford, to the point where everything is fine. Like, I don't give a damn whether, I don't know, with whom you sleep, or what you look like, or what you maybe think, because after all, if you don't have any reason to subvert anything in my politics or society, or these things are already changing in ways that do not even depend on those ideologies sometimes, but still, these ideologies may still exceed in, and so we can counter in other ways rather than discriminating you individually. It's a completely different thing, right? And so it's already what is happening, and I think there's been a great refinement in that idea, and I agree, it's an achievement, right? The greater problem again is the fact that this seems to sometimes have gone too far, especially as far as properly this statal enforcement of certain ideologies is concerned, because it's anti-scientific, and so there is no valid reason why it should work, right? I believe that we should fight against these things in general, but at the same time also don't get paranoid about them, because I believe that if your civilization is really the best one, and you are you would die to defend it, well, at that point nobody can really stop you. If this is ascientific, immoral bullshit, as mostly it is, I mean, think about critical race theory, or gender theory. It's utter delusional. I don't know even how to call it. I mean, it's simply it's narcissism. Again, it's simply a person asking for a favor. There is no science whatsoever to any of that. It's really the consequence of the fact that we have fed people with the delusion that they are special just because they are themselves. Actually not. Most people are utterly disgusting and actually fully deserve what happens to them. Because they do disgusting things, like, and those have consequences, right? So I don't really, in general, right? I'm saying this because even those ideologies stem from realities that have nothing to do, in fact, with racial discrimination or or sexual discrimination, but because actually it's the combination of broader problems that actually come from both sides of the aisle politically, and that brought people to be emarginated, poorer, less educated, less properly guided, etc. And so they derail into this lunacy. But so we should address the causes, not the consequences, that even just giving any relevance to is just an insult to the average dignity of human intelligence. And that's exactly the problem, that the people who should be supporting they should be countering these ideas, are as stupid as those people, because, they're actually nurtured in the same communities. So what do you expect? That you're more intelligent because you're liberal, conservative? You have pretty serious problems, and you are the cause of the problem, as a matter of fact. This goes on and says the five inner demons, so the bad stuff that would allegedly orient you towards violence and all this stuff. Pinker rejects what he calls the hydraulic theory of violence, the idea that humans harbor an inner drive towards aggression, a death instinct or thirst of blood. I absolutely agree. That's culturalist bullshit. It's anti-Clausewitz and it's nothing, which builds up inside us and must periodically be discharged. It may be true just in just like, your adrenaline cycles, right? Go to the gym and you will pass, it's not, get a girlfriend, do something, I don't know. And so, but it's true. I mean, war doesn't depend on that. So nothing could be further from contemporary scientific understanding of the psychology of violence. Instead, he argues research suggests that, quote, aggression is not a single motive, let alone a mounting urge. It's the output of several psychological systems that differ in their environmental triggers, their internal logic, their neurological basis, and their social distribution. Yeah, I agree with that. He examines 5 such systems. 1. Predatory or practical violence. Violence deployed as practical means to an end. Right, so this is actually the base of it all. That's always what violence is at the end of the day. 2. Dominance, the urge for authority, prestige, glory, and power. Pinker argues that dominance motivations can occur within individuals and coalitions of racial, ethnic, religious, or national groups. That's also, I would like to say that if these are the demons, it's not really a negative thing. Again, we need these things, right? And we need exactly, in a sense, to tame them, to achieve them. Right? This is the point. So I agree. Excuse me, I drink a little. It's a long video. So, yes, revenge, the moralistic urge toward retribution, punishment, and justice. So again, I don't think Pinker is really thinking this is a bad thing. I mean, yes, punishing criminals. I mean, you would really like to break their skull, wouldn't you? Why not? It's a positive thing. Sadism, here I am, after what I just said. The deliberate infliction of pain for no purpose but enjoy a person's suffering. Well, yeah, I agree. This may be, you see, retribution and sadism are 2 different things. I don't know why Pinker is putting them together, but I presume that there is something in the inflicting pain for a purpose that does make sense. After all, we all would like these things, but we don't inflict them on others. I mean, this is a very important distinction. If anything, otherwise we would always be killing each other. So this shows that, of course, we don't do this. This was done at a point in which it's mostly the Enlightenment Pinkers likes, when when generally speaking, it was believed that the violence, the pain inflicted, would be like a deterrent aspect. Then at a certain point we realized that the reasons why people may go against the law, etc., are kind of more complex and worth investigation in that way, and that especially, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, it's not really by inflicting pain in some forms at least can make that person improve in a way or another. So there is a huge debate, for example, about death penalty. As you know, other cultures, other countries, some Western countries have it, some other don't, right? So that's an interesting place to be, to discuss, because it also would put Pinker's ideas in a bit of, not really a corner, because of course death penalty is mostly not there in the West, and so that would follow the general trend. But we understood indeed of the fact that unnecessary violence may be an emotionalistic action, just because we wanted, I don't know, there's some trigger in us that is the animal, the instinct, that doesn't really, however, consider rationally what we could obtain as a benefit in a certain reality. So it's always probably a balance, right? You have to punish somebody, even cruelly, sometimes to achieve that result. Sometimes you shouldn't. It depends, right? And the fact that we think about that is actually the fact that we have a control on it is our superiority. Then ideology, a shared belief system, usually involving a vision of utopia that justifies unlimited violence in pursuit of unlimited good. I think that this is true, but I think it's not really about ideology. I think it's mostly about ignorance. It's true that ignorant people can be more ideologically convinced, in a sense, but in that sense there is an antidote for it that does seem to be, let's say, on another base rather than just ideology, because I wouldn't think that ideology is in itself just, in fact, built up within us, right? It's constructed, and it's constructed for some reason and some purpose, and let's say the level of ideologism changes on the level, in life, if indeed when exposed to information, to reasoning, indeed, right? So yeah, I can go, but this idea of the lack of limit is definitely crashes with reality, generally speaking, right? We all are big with words, etc., very often the same ideas, but again, it's like a bit sadism. How far would you go with that in practice, right? It's mostly ideology is some sort of venting, but it does have some consequences on the rest of the people, especially when they are already not just ignorant, but they have maybe a reason to, because they may be easier to convince for some reason or another. So generally speaking, that does come from, the worse you live, generally speaking, that the easier it is to. But it's an interesting take, I give it that. So I'm trying to find something I find particularly wrong, but it's after all pretty balanced, right? At the end of the day, it's where it gets to with it. Then for better angels, Chapter 9, Pinker examines 4 motives that can orient humans away from violence and towards cooperation and altruism. He identifies empathy, which prompts us to feel the pain of others and to align their interests with our own. I would say, yeah, that it's also kind of an instinctive thing. Sometimes you say, there's bastards, then you see the person and everything changes in a way. That's important, but that's also, again, it's present within us. So I do agree that, self-control, which allows to anticipate the consequences of acting on our impulses and to inhibit them accordingly. Yes, and this is kind of much more difficult to attain, especially, the larger the action is. The moral sense, which sanctifies a set of norms and taboos that govern the interactions among people in a culture. These sometimes decrease violence, but can also increase it when the norms are tribal, authoritarian, or puritanical. It's interesting that Pinker puts it in this content, and I do agree as well. We do need that as a glue, and again, things are normally a bit more complex, a bit more universal in nature in general, human-wise, but they're not just, this culture, that culture. That's a talk that we often make, but yeah, I agree with the concept of that. There is always kind of a moral sense, and again, you can always measure through these things the limits of humans. Again, these are I actually like this list because it's it gives like all the, the extremes, right, to both things, right? I'm not saying it's a particularly complete or necessarily, you know, perfectly styled or chosen list, but let's say it does talk about things that are actually so. Then reason, which allows us to extract ourselves from our parochial vantage points. I would say reason is a bit more than that, right? It is indeed capable of showing us that things are how our instincts do not really show. So, but not literally necessarily a parochial thing. Also, reason is actually just, yes, it's extracting ourselves, exactly like in the Kant definition, to the answer in the answer to the question, what is the enlightenment, right? We are able to see rather how things are, so that we can learn more, let's say, about our condition, and so acting more, in fact, more to the point. In this chapter, Pinker also examines and partially rejects the idea that humans have evolved in a biological sense to become less violent, which is actually, I agree with, because again, we're not less violent, really. Right? We haven't evolved even for being so, right? So, again, violence is always necessary, right? So, I don't know whether, what Pinker really thinks about violence per se, that I haven't really understood. It's obvious that when he talks about state, enforcement, justice, retribution, it's obvious that you have to use violence there. So I don't know what Pink is saying or about that. Pinker is saying about it, but I do think, yeah, it gets to that point. But if he says that objectively we evolved even from a situation where we were violent and we were really not designed to be less violent in this sense, I think that, it is also debatable, but meaning that we are violent, yes, this is indirectly basically what he's saying. So I feel like this author has something to say. He evidently had a, rarely when you look at these public intellectuals, they that have such astonishing success, they're just like, frauds broadly meant. He definitely makes some. I don't know how he makes them methodologically, but I personally, just from my experience as a Clausewitzian, as a military historian, I would say, yeah, they're okay, kind of okay. The problem is maybe how to handle them. That is to say, how this is received and interpreted by progressists, and given that Pinker's being criticized by the radical left at this point, you understand that at this point even reasonable ideas, of course, are butchered, and so these ones may be a bit more liberal leaning, but not even radical. And so I personally don't feel like it's the author is making like properly a pacifistic point, or is going against some general assumption. It seems to me he doesn't talk about war per se too much, right? He probably understands that in a general sense, considering all the data that he has framed, with the fact that he studied human mind or things like that, and realizes that war is still part of a decisional process. And this is in fact the point I would save of Pinker the most. Like, properly, when you make war, when you enact violence, it's not really a merely instinctive thing, right? There is always something that you can do to properly decide whether to use it or not. And obviously our civilization and culture in living, say, quality of life have brought us to live in a less violent way. So far here in this list, I don't know, maybe they're hiding it. I think there is no aggression to the concept of war itself. there is a broader aspiration to peace, which is, generally speaking, fine. It's again, most of the times better standpoint than any other. I presume that in Pinker's work there is not like an open statement that says, like, in some moments war is really necessary. Because it would be even wrong, right? It's not necessary in the sense that it can be defined as necessary. We just do it because at that point we assess that may be more advantageous than not, and we may be wrong. And there are surely moments in which making war is more convenient and more legit, let's say. But again, I don't think the author ventures too much into this field, so that many people maybe interpret this work as a sort of pacifistic one, as a sort, you see, and backing culturalism, which Pinker actually doesn't, because those things we've just read are anti-culturalist. But culturalists would just pick this and say, that's it. We have the better culture that brought us to make less war because we're better, so war is bad, should never be done, we should never even think about it. That's a great risk. The fact that we got less violent because we lived a less violent life, we're less exposed to violence, is actually a double-edged sword, because again, it's fine. Again, violence is not a condition, is an action and a tool. So somebody does violence again, and so that's where the problem gets down to. But that's exactly because it's an activity that you should learn. If anything, if somebody ever exercises on you, you should be knowing how to cope with that. And so if you emasculate yourself too much because you think that after all the end is being more lenient, more tolerant, thinking that violence is just it should never be used because it's bad in itself. That's the risk. At that point, you will be weak to the point you will not be able to defend yourself. You will be more likely to lose and actually to come back in a context, but you will be much more acquainted to violence than not. And so there is a balance that we have to maintain. That is essentially a moral balance and a scientific balance at the same time. You should always be driven by a purpose that makes you more aggressive and, generally speaking, open, exposed to the world, to the point it makes you realize that you have to be violent in some way to do anything. At the same time, being reasonable enough to know exactly when it's the better thing, right? It's a better angel actually to make war. And I'm not sure whether Pinker actually talks about that. And this I may be prone to think he does, right? I don't know, given that all the data that apparently he inserts in his work, he probably talks about wars that happened also recently. As you see, he talks about quite recent times, and probably he gets it wrong, especially the lack of the deterrent aspect doesn't depose very much in favor of him as in his general analysis, let's say. But I would say that the scientific side of the story is the reasonable one, is indeed also the one that is needed to exercise violence. And it seems to me that in fact this is being lost nowadays again too. That is to say, not just we killed morality, we also killed science. And those who claim to defend both actually are the ones who don't know it. They know it the least. And that practically are, in fact, aggressing the same Pinker that says on the ground of reason something that can be shared. Then, about Pinker's fascination with the Enlightenment, honestly, I should have spent maybe more time on this, but let's say I don't think that the Enlightenment can, again, it is a cause. The Enlightenment is a consequence, as the author seems to acknowledge, again, of a context. Right, so I don't know why like for him it's so important, like why the Enlightenment and not like the sum of all the things that we have achieved before and after. The Enlightenment may have been an important turning point, but I've been hearing it too often mentioned among progressives, liberals, and even some conservatives that vote actually in that narrative. That is definitely positivistic and somewhat even to in fact scientistic, and with all the risks of determinism and a kind of sort of easy solution to things. That the Enlightenment is before the Enlightenment it was the darkness, that we shouldn't consider anything about that the religions were bad, that just this moment open to who knows what. It really didn't happen like that, right? Actually, if you read the Enlightenment authors, they're somewhat pretty banal and sometimes even pretty bigot and pretty unrealistic and unscientific. There are so many important things we got from that, but also the Enlightenment was a quite complex thing altogether. It's more like an era rather than a movement, all in all, with different outcomes that, again, were not even connected properly to the same ideologies, right? So I of course appreciated the Enlightenment, especially as much as it brought on the fore the idea of reason, right? Reason really meant as a scientific understanding of the world that at some point was challenged by saying, I say this without demonstrating it, and you should be obeying to the idea. Well, even if that was true, you should at least find a method to teach that person, to make that person understand. If what happened on the Enlightenment is that actually is that science broke through in a world that was kind of crystallized in a tradition that essentially defended an establishment, and that was brought to an end. Again, it could be done better by better forces, by better thinkers. The Enlightenment also pretty in fact degenerated into else, for better and for worse actually, but from its original intent also it was already based on previous ideas. So again, we could probably make without the idealization of so many things, including not just the Enlightenment, but the sense that, for example, the use of violence as per se is a sort of meter for the evaluation of how a civilization is advanced. It's arguable. It's arguable because a civilization, this is the point, and that's maybe because rightly Pinker was criticized as just centering too much on Europe. Europe did dominate the world at some point, or overly, generally speaking, the West in general, over the world. But unfortunately, what happens is that these values, first of all, were not universal because there were other people that fundamentally didn't quite acquire them to this day. In part, this reason, as Pinker found out in the last year, apparently, is needed ever more, even among the world that created it, because actually it's also an internal problem. It's not just about other culture, civilization. It's also about other people within the system. That's why I always aggress the fourth estate, because nobody ever told the fourth estate to be what reason or morality actually is, and we're paying for it. So, in other words, this thing can go back and forth together with civilization, but also a civilization is within others. So it could be that a world, like let's say a country or a continent, is brought under attack, in probably in part, as we've seen, because it may have lost part of its warlikeness and habituation to strategic education and culture, which doesn't flatter those who attack him, that may be easily underdeveloped in comparison, in absolute terms, including the same strategic ones, because in fact the world is not one yet, and so it may always happen that you are under the use of violence. At the same under violence, this is the same case politically and socially within the same country. So what I dislike of Pinker is this mythology. There is also the Fukuyama's one that everything will always go better. We haven't lived enough to see that happening on a statistic base, even if that was the only way you could measure that. And on the contrary, I think that albeit the idea of morality and reason are essentially the core of it all, and it's functional, we may not have properly an indicator of how that, in fact, morality and science are, how strong they are within a certain civilization until the moment to recur to violence is used, right? And this can be measured, of course, internally as well. So you can see whether in a country, what's the crime rate and the quality of life, also, in relation to violence and so on. But it comes on the fore when a country is really under attack, a military attack, which is a much more risky thing, because it's, generally speaking, easy to maintain a system stable within a certain degree of political compaction. Then when the external force arrives, at that point you have to measure the understanding of the connection of war instrumentally to politics, to understand whether that civilization is really strong enough and intelligent enough. And it can happen in many ways. Again, it doesn't even have necessarily to be it must be a political solution, right? Doesn't matter whether military or not. It's always about politics. It's always about reason, right? Because politics, as you know, in the Clausewitzian triad, is the second element. It corresponds to the government and reason. And so that's what we should expect, and that's why political compaction is important. If you can't even agree on the use of violence, that's a pretty bad place to be as a civilization. So I guess that Pinker may have polluted waters a bit in that sense, because he was riding the wave of liberal cheering towards pacifism, and his work may have even been, in fact, misunderstood by the same left and pacifists, because it doesn't actually seem at all to be heading towards that direction. Then whether Pinker is kind of more or less serious scholar or persona, I don't even know, because just look at a bunch of pictures, never even heard him speaking, on, as you've seen, even read what he says. But let's say if the ideas exposed are the ones you find here, it's, the core is fundamentally okay. I don't see much of a problem. Again, this core is can be polluted in a way or another, and so it's very easy to do. Now, certain affirmations that seemingly Pinker made in function of some criticism, in response to some criticism, etc., to these ideas, seem to me like less elaborated and insightful than the ones here on Wikipedia were listed, like that quotes the book, after all. So it's obvious that in a debate you're expressing yourself, in a vocal debate you're expressing yourself in a bit less of a primitive way, superficial, simplistic way, or emotional way. It's normal. But at the same time, so yeah, I'm not saying maybe the guy is the genius that the entire, culture may have made him of, just because of the aforementioned reason. But, he surely knows his deal. At least he says, of all the terrible things that you hear nowadays, at least what I've read from here is not the worst thing you can read, right? It's sensible. It's just, it could maybe be a bit more precise and, in fact, clear on the issue of war, because it seems like, if you really approach the question just in terms of statistically how many wars there have been, and you don't even take into account deterrence as an element, it's not even there the worst issue, because the concept of deterrence was not born with nuclear weapons, but it may be a big elephant in the room that you would like to address better. And the same goes for war in itself. Like, does Pinker point ever out that war was a major force in the construction of civilization, as it's also one of its greatest potential destroyers? There is no doubt of that. That's a question that Pinker, if he didn't, should answer a bit better, and realizing that war, all in all, is not really the worst thing that can happen in determinate circumstances, because it really depends on politics and on what it is at stake. So pacifism is of no use for that, and the same reason tells you. So on that ground, I think that's as far as I can go, at least given the information that I have at this point on this topic. So for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.